Hi. Today I want to talk about at least some of the ways we talk about the persecution of Christians in America and why we might want to rethink how we talk about some of those things. I want to start off by saying that I do think it's true that American attitudes towards Christians and Christianity have changed dramatically over the past few decades. I remember being a kid, and even when I was outside of the church, I remember thinking positively of the church. I think that was generally a positive thing in the world. In addition to that anecdotal evidence, though, there are some more objective studies that make the same point. I referred many times over the last few years to a Pew study that when they asked millennials about whether or not the church was a good thing in the world, only 55% said yes. And as I've made clear other times I brought this up, it's not that 55% of millennials, and millennials aren't just kids these days anymore, it's not that 55% love the church and 45% are okay with it. It's that when they were asked whether or not the world's a better place because the church is in it, only 55% could say yes. Since my very earliest days in the church, I have heard people argue that the end times must be coming because there is increasing and unprecedented persecution of the church throughout the world. And there may be some truth to that, so I don't want to just dismiss that out of hand. That being said, though, I think sometimes our emotions can run away with us and we can lose sight of what's really important, and that's what I want to reflect on in this video. The first presidential election that I was able to participate in was in 2004 between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And at the time, basically all of my friends who were even a little bit evangelical said that as Christians, we have to vote for Bush because if John Kerry became president, then Christianity would very quickly become persecuted and would collapse. This video is really not trying to make a case about whether people should or should not have voted for Bush. I had a cluster of convictions at the time, some of which have changed and some of which have only deepened since that time. I'm not really trying to make a point about that election. I'm trying to clarify that no matter what we may say, we often behave as if today, right now, this very moment, is the very worst that the church has ever had it. This is important because there are two things we might mean by this. We might mean that it's the toughest for the church in America that it's ever been, or we might be making the much bigger claim that it is the toughest for the church across the world as it has ever been. If all we mean when we say that is that times are tougher for me or people in my area than it used to be, that statement might actually be true. And if that's the case, then the response to that should be things like we should be reevaluating. What exactly is our faith? What is it based on? And how do we engage in faithfulness in a situation we're not used to? My worry is that at least sometimes people mean it in a much bigger way than this. It's as if that Christians, or at least in my own experience, that relatively well-to-do Christians in the American rural Midwest are somehow experiencing hardships that are seen to have cosmic significance. This troubles me even more because when these kind of conversations take place, at least in my experience, it seems as though it inclines people not to ask questions like, what does it mean to be a faithful disciple in new and difficult circumstances? How can I be faithful in this new day and in a new way? But rather inclines people to say, well, that's it. It's too late. There's nothing more that can be done. Last summer, I worked at a church camp and I led a breakout group that dealt with issues about the Bible and theology. And some of the time that we spent together was spent with me teaching and leading discussions about certain aspects of Bible study that you might not pick up on a normal Sunday morning. But there was also a lot of time for discussion and question and answers. At one point in one of the discussions, there was a young man who directed my attention to a passage in Mark that was dealing with things that will happen before the end. And after he finished reading that to me, he looked at me and he says, "Do you think that we are in that time right now?" My first response to that was perhaps a little bit too tongue-in-cheek. I said that we're already way past that, by which I meant that Mark's original audience would have heard these words of Jesus and concluded that he was describing what they were already going through. But I realized I needed to give more context to my answer than just that. In my perspective, it seems a bit odd to describe Christians as an overtly persecuted group of people in a country like America, where the overwhelming majority of elected officials are either Christians or else want everyone to think that they're Christians in order to get elected. Things could actually be far worse for us as Christians in America today than they have ever been, without it necessarily mean that we're really being persecuted. It seems to me that the solution to this way of thinking is to study a bit of church history and to be reminded of the times in history when Christians really have been legitimately persecuted, and also to pay attention to the ways in which Christians around the world are persecuted even to this day. The examples that I used were the widely reported stories back in 2015, where ISIS was rounding up and beheading Christians by the dozen for their faith. And when I remember those stories and then I look at my own experience, I realize I have to take a step back before I get too excited about complaining about my being persecuted in my experience. I want to make sure I'm being clear. I'm not trying to say that we all just need to be happy about anything that happens to go on in our country. And I'm not trying to say we shouldn't be advocates for the kinds of change we would like to see in our society. I'm just saying that the examples of the actual Christians who are literally suffering and dying for their faith should make us take a step back and realize that certain social changes or certain laws being passed that we don't like just really aren't the same. Also, if we're going to portray the inconveniences that we experience as Christians in America as actual, legitimate, and overt persecution, we have to come to terms with two things. First, we have to realize that other people who really have been treated poorly and who really don't have their views at least nominally represented by the majority of politicians in our country are going to find it really hard to take us seriously when we complain about being persecuted. Secondly, we have to be prepared to do one of two things. Either we have to be able to go up to these people whose loved ones were tortured and murdered for their faith and look them in the eye and explain to them that it's we here in America who have our cultural and political situations that know what real persecution is, or we have to be prepared to spend more of our time devoted to discipleship and to prayer. Again, none of this is meant to say that we should just give up on values and convictions. And I'm not trying to deny the very real social changes that have taken place over the past several decades. It's just that it's important that we don't become distracted by these things and kind of shut down in ministry, hoping that Jesus will just swoop in and make everything better. There are lots of people who've experienced far worse than we ever had, and they have endured in the midst of it. We should join them. Well, that's all for this time. If you have any questions or topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.